The bride walked out of the chapel. The groom stood frozen, not understanding what had just happened. Minutes ago he thought he'd already won. A man who always came out on top was now the one being left behind. Before we begin the story, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Lucas Marshall entered the party like he owned the place. He didn't need to speak. His tailored suit, that confident half-smile, the way his eyes scanned the room without apology, he didn't just walk into spaces, he dominated them. A young CEO, wealthy, sharp, always in control. To Lucas, life was a game, and he played to win. Multi-million-dollar deals? Closed before the first drink. Beautiful women? They came to him, never the other way around. Emotions? Weakness, a waste of time, not in his vocabulary. That night, high above Manhattan in a penthouse glittering with city lights, his longtime friend Jack raised a glass and tossed out a challenge that made the air go still for a moment. "You think you can win anything, don't you?" Jack said, smirking. "Try this." Lucas tilted his head, intrigued. "Go on." "Marry someone who isn't your type. No models, no gold diggers, no emotional strings. Just real. Live with her for 6 months. If you last, I'll give you $1 million. The group around them burst into laughter. Lucas didn't. He wasn't hesitating. He was calculating. It wasn't the money that tempted him, but the challenge? The idea that someone thought he couldn't pull it off? That was irresistible. "Pick the girl," Lucas said, calm and certain. "I'll marry her." Jack was ready. He already had a name. Chloe Richards. Not a model, not a socialite. She worked at a non-profit, lived simply, and stood on her own. She didn't need a man, and she sure as hell didn't need Lucas Marshall. A few days later, Lucas received her profile. Nothing flashy, except the eyes. In a grainy ID photo, she looked straight at the camera with an unbothered, almost defiant stare. There was no awe, no fear, no interest. That made him curious. Women usually adored him. But her? She looked like she didn't care who he was. Lucas picked up the phone. "Set up dinner," he said. "I want to meet her." Not because he believed in love, but because he believed no one could resist him. And if this was a game, he was going to play it to the end. Lucas Marshall was always in control. Every deal, every dinner, every person who crossed his path, he read them, predicted them, played them like a game he'd already won. So when he entered the private dining room of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, he expected to find a woman quietly impressed by the setting, maybe even flattered by the attention. He was wrong. Chloe Richards sat alone, a glass of water untouched in front of her. She wasn't looking around at the lavish crystal chandeliers or the velvet-draped booths. She didn't fidget with her silverware or check her reflection in the polished gold utensils. She was waiting, still and steady, like someone fully aware she was walking into the lion's den, but not the least bit afraid. Lucas approached with the kind of smooth confidence that had disarmed CEOs, politicians, and socialites alike. "You must be Chloe Richards." She looked up with a calm, unreadable expression. "And you must be Lucas Marshall." There was no warmth in her voice, no hesitation, just simple acknowledgement. He extended his hand. She shook it, firmly. No softness, no performative politeness. They sat. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "I was told you were direct." "I was told you were arrogant," she replied, matching his tone without flinching. "So far, we're both living up to expectations." Lucas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Shall we skip the small talk, then?" Chloe leaned forward slightly, hands folded neatly in front of her. "I know about the bet." Lucas paused, just for a beat. Then he leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, doing his best to appear unshaken. "And yet here you are," he said, voice smooth like silk over glass. "I have my reasons," Chloe answered, "but I want to make something clear from the beginning." She didn't wait for his response. "This marriage isn't about love. It's not about status. And I'm not some project you can mold or a puzzle you're trying to solve. I'm not here to be impressed, seduced, or controlled. 6 months, that's all. After that, we walk away." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "You say that like you're setting the rules." "I'm not," she said. "I'm stating the boundaries." That struck him harder than he expected. Most people, especially women, approached him with caution, or awe, or hunger. Chloe, on the other hand, offered him none of that. Only clarity. Only resistance. He stared at her for a moment longer, not saying a word. In this silence, a new kind of energy crackled between them. Tense, not romantic. Competitive. This woman wasn't playing by his rules, which in a strange way made her even more intriguing. "You realize I don't lose," he said finally, his voice soft but laced with warning. Chloe met his gaze, steady as stone. "Then this will be your first lesson in humility." Their meals arrived. Neither of them touched their food. The rest of the dinner was not conversation. It was chess. Each word carefully measured, each silence deliberate, every glance a subtle move on a board that neither had mapped out entirely, but both intended to win. A few days later, they signed the papers. No celebration, no smiles, no engagement photos or champagne toasts. It was more like a business transaction. Cold, precise, mutually beneficial. They moved into Lucas's penthouse, an expanse of glass and marble perched above the noise of the city. From the outside, it looked like power and luxury. But inside, it was two people circling each other like predators. He gave her the master bedroom. She declined and chose the guest room instead. He offered her access to everything, his staff, his credit cards, his schedule. She politely refused. He tried small talk at dinner. She answered with one-word replies. This wasn't a romance. It wasn't even a war. It was a silent battle of will, two forces resisting gravity, pretending they could orbit each other without ever colliding. And yet, even in their silence, something was shifting. Lucas, so used to being obeyed, admired, adored, was beginning to realize something uncomfortable. He didn't understand this woman. He couldn't predict her. And worse, he couldn't stop thinking about her. He had entered this game thinking Chloe was the one being tested. But slowly, without warning, the test was turning back on him. And for the first time in a long time, Lucas Marshall wasn't sure he'd win. Lucas Marshall had never been ignored in his own home, especially not by someone who lived under the same roof. But Chloe Richards wasn't like anyone he'd ever encountered. She didn't flinch at the grandeur of his penthouse, didn't comment on the priceless art or the view that stretched across all of Manhattan. She didn't ask about his cars or his wealth or his lifestyle. She simply existed beside him, unmoved, self-contained, distant, and Lucas couldn't stop watching her. At first, it was irritation. He told himself that. He'd married her as a joke, a bet, one more win to add to his record. But now, he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't the one being studied. He was. She didn't try to charm him. She didn't try to change him. She simply stayed the same. And that consistency, that quiet strength, it started pulling at something in him he didn't know how to name. One evening, the penthouse was unusually quiet. Lucas had skipped dinner meetings and come home early, more out of restlessness than intention. He found Chloe in the kitchen. Not the chef, not the staff. Chloe. Hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, barefoot, moving with practiced ease as she chopped vegetables and stirred a simple pot of soup. The kitchen, usually sterile, polished, untouched, was suddenly alive. Steam clouded the air. The scent of garlic and broth lingered like a memory from another life. She didn't look up when he entered. "Didn't feel like takeout tonight," she said casually. "I made enough for two." Lucas stood there, unsure what to do with his hands, or his thoughts. He wasn't used to being offered anything without conditions. He wasn't used to home feeling like home. They sat down at the counter. She didn't ask him questions, didn't fill the silence with forced politeness, and for once, he didn't feel the need to perform. He took a bite. It was simple, warm, familiar in a way he hadn't felt in years, and then, without warning, he laughed. A short, genuine laugh, one that surprised even him. Chloe looked up, puzzled. "What?" He shook his head. "Nothing. It's just, I haven't tasted anything this real in a long time." She smiled faintly. "It's just soup, Lucas." "No," he said, still smiling. "It's not." There was a pause between them. Not awkward, but weighted. Something unspoken passed across the counter, something softer than a challenge, quieter than attraction. It was the beginning of a shift neither of them had planned for. That night, Lucas lay awake longer than usual, not because he was plotting or calculating, but because he couldn't stop thinking about the way Chloe stirred the soup, the way she didn't look at him like he was powerful or important, the way her silence wasn't cold, it was dignified, safe. He had set out to win a bet, but now, for reasons he didn't understand, he wasn't sure who was winning, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to. Something changed in Chloe. It started subtly. A longer pause between glances, the way her shoulders tensed when Lucas entered the room, how her eyes, once calm and indifferent, now carried something darker. Resentment. Lucas noticed. She didn't lash out. She didn't accuse. She simply pulled away, piece by piece, and it was driving him mad. He tried to pretend nothing was wrong, tried to close the space between them with gestures, with quiet kindness. But every time he stepped forward, Chloe stepped further back. She watched him like a stranger. Then came the night he couldn't ignore it anymore. She sat on the balcony, staring at the city below. Silent, still, distant. And Lucas, standing behind the glass, felt like an outsider in his own home. That night, long after she had gone to bed, he opened his laptop. He typed in the name of a company she had casually mentioned once, Richards & Company. The moment the search results loaded, his blood went cold. It was there, the acquisition, the buyout, the destruction. A deal he'd closed 6 years ago, ruthless, efficient, brutal. He remembered it vaguely. Small family business, financially unstable. He'd absorbed the assets and let the rest rot. Standard procedure. But then, he saw the article. A headline he hadn't read at the time, buried in local news. Former CEO of Richards & Company dies by suicide following company collapse. His chest tightened. The name, David Richards, Chloe's father. Lucas leaned back in his chair, the room spinning around him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She knew. All this time she knew. The marriage, the agreement, her cold composure. It wasn't random. It was revenge. The next morning, Chloe sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, silent as ever. Lucas walked in, pale, tense, jaw clenched. "You planned this," he said quietly. She didn't look at him. "From the beginning. You knew who I was. What I did." Chloe set her cup down, slowly, precisely. Then finally she met his eyes, and in them, there was no fear. Only fire. "You don't remember him, do you?" Her voice was calm. Too calm. Lucas didn't answer. "My father," she continued, "built that company from nothing, worked through illness, fought for his employees, and you tore it apart like it was a chess piece. You didn't even blink." He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "I didn't know." "No," Chloe said sharply. "You didn't care to know." There it was. The break. The wound finally split open. "You destroyed everything. Our home, our savings, his dignity. And when there was nothing left, he ended it." Her voice trembled, not with weakness, but with pain so deep it had turned to steel. Lucas staggered back, hands gripping the counter. His mind raced, trying to connect, to apologize, to explain. But there was nothing. No word. No gesture. No grand gesture of redemption could undo what had been done. Chloe stood. "This wasn't about your bet, Lucas," she said. "This was about watching you slowly become the man you made my father feel like. Small, helpless, broken." And with that, she walked past him. No drama, no screaming. Just the quiet power of truth. Lucas remained frozen, hearing the door of her room click shut behind her. The silence that followed was unbearable. For the first time in his life, he felt what it meant to truly lose. Not money, not a deal, but the one thing he never knew he wanted to keep. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. Lucas sat at the edge of the living room sofa, elbows on his knees, staring blankly at the hardwood floor. The city lights flickered behind the glass wall, but he didn't notice them tonight. Not this time. He had spent the entire day trying to find the right words. There weren't any. Chloe finally entered the room. Her footsteps were soft, but her presence was sharp, like walking into cold air. She didn't sit, just stood across from him. Lucas raised his head, met her gaze. He had rehearsed 100 versions of this moment. None of them matched the silence between them now. "Chloe," his voice cracked. "I didn't know." She let out a breath, half a scoff, half a sigh. "No," she said slowly. "You never do." Lucas tried to reach for something, anything that could soften the moment. But Chloe had waited long enough. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned. "You don't remember my father," she said. "But he remembered you, right up until the day he died." Lucas's breath hitched. "He remembered your name, your face, the letter you sent with your lawyers, the final blow that ended everything he'd built. You were just doing business. But for us, it was the end of a world." Lucas tried to respond, but she raised her hand, not in anger but in finality. "You want the truth?" Her tone dropped, trembling but steady. "I married you for one reason. Revenge." Those words hit harder than any insult ever could. "I wanted you to feel powerless, questioned, like your decisions didn't matter. I wanted to see if someone like you could ever feel what you made us live with." Lucas looked at her, stunned. He had no script for this, no defense. Then came the silence again. Long, agonizing. Chloe's jaw tightened. Her next words came quieter. "There's one more thing." She didn't look at him when she said it. "I was pregnant." Time stopped. "It was early, barely a few weeks. I never even got to tell him, my father. But when the company collapsed, when our world fell apart, I lost the baby. The stress, the grief. It just happened." Lucas couldn't speak. His lips parted, but no sound came. "I buried that alone," she said. "I buried them alone. And while you were signing another contract, we were mourning something you didn't even know you destroyed." She turned away then. Not dramatically, not angrily. Just broken. Lucas stood but didn't move closer. The air between them was thick, a wall of memories, of mistakes, of things that couldn't be undone. Chloe whispered, "You were never supposed to fall for me, Lucas. And I was never supposed to care what you felt, but I do. And that makes all of this so much worse." Lucas took a step forward, desperate. "Chloe, please." But she turned. "I don't want apologies," she said. "I want silence. I want you to live with the echo of what you've done." Then, without waiting for another word, she left the room. The door closed gently behind her. And Lucas Marshall, man of power, man of pride, stood alone in the stillness of his penthouse, realizing that for the first time in his life, he had broken something he could never fix. Lucas Marshall no longer tried to control the narrative. The man who once dictated boardrooms, silenced opposition with a pen stroke, and lived his life behind mirrored windows of a penthouse empire, now walked through rain-soaked streets, unsure of his place in the world he had helped break. He didn't shave for days. His designer suits hung looser. His voice, once sharp and commanding, grew quieter. Because now he wasn't speaking to investors or media. He was knocking on doors he had once closed forever. The first was in Queens. A widow, 72 years old, who once ran a bakery before a forced buyout crushed her savings and her spirit. She opened the door with suspicion, and nearly shut it when she saw his face. But Lucas didn't flinch. "I'm not here to make excuses," he said. "I'm here to say I was wrong." She didn't cry. She didn't forgive. But she listened. That was enough. One door became 10. 10 became 50. He gave money, yes, but more than that, he gave time. Listened to their stories. Remembered their names. He sat in kitchens and community centers. Heard about lost homes, lost dreams, lost lives. Each conversation was a mirror, showing him the cost of his ambition. Chloe watched it unfold. At first, she kept her distance. Quiet. Detached. She still didn't trust him. Not completely. Not yet. But she saw it. He canceled deals. Dissolved shell companies. Sold off assets that once symbolized his power, now symbols of pain. One night, Chloe stood in the hallway of their apartment, half hidden by the shadows. Lucas didn't see her there. He was at the kitchen table, alone, staring down at an old photograph. A family business ribbon cutting. One of the men smiling in the picture was her father. Lucas ran a finger over the image. His eyes were red. He whispered something no one else could hear. "I'm sorry." That was the first time Chloe believed he wasn't just trying to win her back. He was trying to be someone new. But trust, once broken, doesn't return with apologies. It lingers at the edge of hope, testing every gesture, questioning every motive. And Chloe wasn't ready to cross that line. One morning she asked, almost out of nowhere, "Why now, Lucas?" He looked up from his coffee. "Because I thought regret would be enough," he said. "But I wake up every day with your voice in my head. Your father's face. That baby we never got to meet. I don't want to be the man who walks away from that like it's just business." Chloe didn't answer. She simply walked away. But her silence no longer felt like ice. It felt like hesitation. And that was a beginning. Lucas had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head, but when it finally came, he wasn't standing under a spotlight. He wasn't dressed in a perfectly tailored tux or flanked by photographers. There was no audience, no music, no script, only silence and fear. It was past midnight. The city glowed far below, distant and irrelevant. In the penthouse, the air was still, broken only by the soft hum of the radiator and the occasional creak of old floorboards. Lucas stood by the window, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a small velvet box. His fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of what this meant, of what it didn't guarantee. He turned the box over in his hand slowly, again and again. Behind him, soft footsteps. Chloe. She entered without speaking, hair loose, her expression unreadable. She'd been distant all day, as she had been for weeks, not cold but cautious, guarded, as though she were waiting for something she didn't believe would come. Lucas turned. For a moment, neither of them said a word. Then he took a breath and spoke, gently, carefully, as if afraid the words might crack between them. "I know I don't deserve a second chance," he said, voice low, eyes on hers. "But I'm not asking for your forgiveness tonight. I'm asking for your hope." He opened the box. Inside wasn't a flashy diamond or any kind of grand gesture. It was a simple gold ring with a faint engraving only visible up close. No more games. "I want to marry you again," Lucas continued, stepping closer. "Not for a bet, not for pride, not to prove anything. I want to marry you because I love you, and I'm ready to spend the rest of my life earning your trust back." Chloe's gaze dropped to the ring, then back to him. He was different now. The arrogance, the control, it was gone. What stood before her wasn't the man who had once tried to buy her with wealth and power. This was a man stripped down to truth, and trembling in its presence. She said nothing, but her silence softened. Tears welled in her eyes, not from pain, but from the quiet collapse of every wall she'd built. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke. "I never thought I'd hear you say those words," she whispered. "Not like this." Lucas stepped closer. "You don't have to say yes. Not tonight. Not even this year. But I needed you to know that I'm not leaving. I'm not walking away. Whatever time it takes, I'll be here." She stared at him, through him, searching for the man she once vowed to hate. Instead, she found someone who had bled for the truth, and for the first time, she let her hand reach for his. Then a nod, silent, small, but enough. Weeks later, in a small countryside garden north of the city, Chloe and Lucas stood under a canopy of golden leaves. There were no chandeliers, no designer gowns, just the smell of fresh pine, the sound of wind through the trees, and the soft murmur of a few close friends seated in wooden chairs. Chloe wore a simple ivory dress, no veil, no makeup beyond a soft tint to her lips. Her eyes were all the light she needed. Lucas wore a navy suit, no tie. He'd never looked less polished, or more present. When they faced each other, there were no officiants reading rehearsed words, no legal language or long speeches, just this. Lucas took her hands in his. "I can't promise perfection," he said, "but I promise honesty, and the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything in return." Chloe blinked through tears, but her voice was steady. "I still carry the past," she said, "but today, I choose not to let it define our future. I choose you, as you are now, not the man you were, but the one standing in front of me." They exchanged rings quietly. No applause followed, only stillness and peace. They kissed, not with hunger or relief, but with reverence. Two souls finally meeting in the same place, at the same time. That night they returned to the penthouse not as strangers sharing a space, but as two people beginning again. They sat on the floor of the living room, barefoot, drinking tea in silence. No music, no champagne, just the low hum of city life in the distance. And the sound of something new growing between them. Not a fairy tale, not a victory, but something rare, earned love. And that was more than enough. That morning was unusually still. Soft sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting a gentle glow across the kitchen. Chloe sat motionless at the table, her fingers trembling as they held a small, slender test. A pregnancy test. 2 lines. She had checked it 5 times, and each time the result had not changed. She was pregnant. Her heart pounded, not with fear but with something more complicated. Joy, anxiety, loneliness, hope. The emotions tangled inside her like threads with no beginning. Behind her, Lucas stood quietly at the doorway. He said nothing, but one look at her eyes told him everything had changed. Chloe handed him the test. Lucas took it carefully, staring at the result in stunned silence. Then came a long pause. When he finally looked up, his eyes were no longer the eyes of a man used to winning every game. They were the eyes of someone humbled, afraid, grateful, deeply moved. "I will be the kind of father this child deserves," he said hoarsely, "and the husband you deserve to be loved by." Chloe didn't answer. She simply nodded and turned away, placing a gentle hand on her stomach, as if grounding herself in the miracle unfolding within. Lucas stepped forward, then stopped. He knew. Love might be blooming between them, but trust was still fragile. Asterisk, life between them slowly began to shift. Lucas started waking early, learning to make breakfast, not to impress but to share. He learned to stay quiet when she needed space, to listen when she vented about nausea, fatigue, or sudden cravings. Each time he held her steady, rubbed her back, or sat silently by her side. He wasn't trying to fix anything. He was simply there. Chloe, too, began to open. There were days she smiled. Not the guarded smirk of old, but a soft, real smile. Sometimes she let Lucas rest a hand on her belly, feeling for the tiny heartbeat. And sometimes she let herself fall asleep in his arms, not because she forgot the past, but because, for a moment, she didn't feel the need to protect herself from him. But there were still nights she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering, could she really believe this man had changed? Or was this just another version of control? This time dressed as tenderness. Lucas sensed this too. He didn't push. He didn't ask for her trust. He didn't demand to be seen as redeemed. He understood that a wounded heart doesn't heal with promises. It heals with presence. And each day she stayed, each time she didn't pull away, was a gift. A chance to rebuild brick by brick, slowly, patiently. To outsiders, they might have looked like a couple who had made it through the storm. But only they knew. The storm had passed, yes, but the wreckage was still being cleared. And happiness? It wasn't a destination. It was a choice, a struggle, a journey, one they had now chosen to walk, side by side. For the child, for themselves, and for a future, that, for the first time, both of them wanted to protect. The late afternoon sun spilled through the windows of a modest home tucked away on the outskirts of the city. Not the glass tower Lucas once ruled from, but a quiet 2-story house with chipped white shutters and a yard that needed mowing. And yet, inside, it held something that no penthouse ever could. Chloe stood barefoot in the nursery. The walls were soft cream. The crib was hand-carved by Lucas himself, imperfect, a bit uneven on one side, but made with his own 2 hands. A mobile hung above, spinning slowly, its paper stars fluttering in the warm air. Her fingers rested gently on her rounded belly. She felt the baby move, a subtle, fluttering kick, and smiled softly to herself. This life growing inside her was not born from vengeance. It was born from survival, from transformation, from something raw and real. Behind her, Lucas entered the room quietly, carrying a small music box. He had spent weeks restoring it, polishing every gear and hinge. He placed it gently on the shelf, careful not to disturb the stillness of the moment. Chloe turned. Their eyes met. Lucas didn't speak right away. Words often failed him now, not because he didn't have them, but because he finally understood their weight. He had once spoken with power, with manipulation. Now he spoke with care. "I never knew," he began, voice low, "what love really looked like. I thought it was something to win, something to control. But it's not." He stepped closer, then knelt in front of her. Slowly, reverently, he placed his hands on her belly, feeling the pulse of new life beneath his palms. "It's this," he whispered. "This second chance. This miracle I didn't deserve." Chloe's eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with something steadier. Peace. Grace. She placed her hand over his. "I won't pretend it's been easy," she said quietly. "There are still nights I remember everything, the silence, the anger, the loss. But when I see you now, when I watch you build cribs and serve soup and ask nothing in return, I start to believe in you." Lucas looked up at her, his voice rough with sincerity. "I want to do this right," he said. "All of it. The baby. Us. I want to marry you again, but this time for real. Not for a bet, not for a win, just because I love you." For a long moment, Chloe said nothing. Then she nodded, not with dramatic flair, not with romantic exaggeration, just a quiet, trembling nod from a woman who had learned how to protect her heart and was finally ready to open it again. Their second wedding was nothing like the first. There were no champagne fountains, no headlines, no tailored suits flown in from Europe. Instead, they stood in their backyard beneath an old maple tree, its leaves turning gold in the early autumn breeze. A few close friends, a justice of the peace, a couple of wooden chairs for Chloe's mother and Lucas's old friend Jack, who looked as if he still couldn't believe how far things had come. Chloe wore a simple white dress. Lucas wore a soft gray suit, the sleeves slightly too long. He'd bought it at a local store because this time the label didn't matter. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, vows that didn't promise perfection, but presence. "I can't erase what I've done," Lucas said, holding her hands. "But I will show up every day and try to be the man you see when you look at me now." "And I can't promise I'll never remember the pain," Chloe replied, her voice trembling. "But I'll choose to see who you've become, not who you were." When they kissed, it wasn't cinematic. It was real, messy, tearful, but full of meaning. And when they held each other afterward, they both understood. They were building something that didn't need to be flashy. It only needed to be true. Later that evening, they sat together in the nursery, soft music playing from the old box Lucas had repaired. Lucas leaned in close, his hand once again resting on her belly. "Who would have thought," he said, smiling faintly, "a stupid bet would teach me how to love?" Chloe laughed, a soft, tired, beautiful sound. "And I," she said, brushing his cheek with her fingers, "learned how to forgive." They stayed like that for a long time, the silence between them no longer heavy, but warm. There would be more hard days ahead, sleepless nights, old memories resurfacing when least expected. But for now, they had a beginning dot, not perfect dot, but real dot. And sometimes that's enough. What about you? If you were Chloe, could you forgive? Could you love again? Let us know in the comments. We read every story. If you believe that people can change and that love deserves a second chance, subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart. And if you made it to the end, type Grace below. Your presence here means more than you know.